Welcome to the Contagious Code podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I am Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and more. Today, my guest is Corbin Crutchley. Corbin is the author of the popular free book, The Framework Field Guide, which teaches developers frameworks like React, Angular, and Vue all at once, completely for free. It's a great way to level up your programming. And, when I say things are a great way, this sounds like an endorsement, but guess what? It's free. It costs literally nothing. It dives into the nuance and the detail between things like React, Angular, and Vue, and really teaches you the underlying mechanism of them, like what makes a framework, how does rendering work. In our discussion today, we dive very deep into that specific topic. We dive deep into React, Angular, and Vue, what makes them unique, what makes them useful for building on the web, why do you even need a framework? And we go into the details there. We talk about state management libraries, and we talk about open source, all of this around building user interfaces on the web via frameworks. Corbin gives away this book entirely for free, and there's a reason for that, which we also get into in the episode, where Corbin mentions he's got schizophrenia and a number of mental illnesses, not excluding, bipolar disorder. And he says, look, there's barriers to entry, and sometimes the barriers are external forces like discrimination and marginalization, and other times the barriers are internal by our own illness, either physical or mental. And tech is something that fundamentally changed the course of Corbin's life in a profound way. As was mine. For those of you who know my story, I have a bleeding disorder, and tech is really the thing that literally saved my life. If you don't know that, we'll maybe put a link in the show notes. But it's this vehicle for radical transformation and improvement of one's life. And so Corbin's mission is because of that. It's because he has so profoundly benefited from software, from tech, when he was in a really dark place, that he decided he's going to create resources to sort of pay it forward. Part of that is also Playful Programming, the nonprofit organization that Corbin founded, under which the Framework Field Guide exists, and newer developments are coming. We also dive into those new developments in this episode. This episode is jam-packed full of insights into frameworks and technical detail, but also it's not lost on me how this episode is really just about hope. It's about hope that any one of us, with the right resources and the right barriers removed, can create a career in tech that enables us to thrive. And that's what I want you to take away from this episode. Now, I'd like to offer this to all of us at no cost, because this is separate to my day job. And the way we can do that is through partners and sponsors. Let's take a moment to acknowledge them. The Contagious Code podcast is partnered with Code Crafters. Code Crafters is a thing like Corbin's Framework Field Guide. Honestly, it just makes coding accessible to everyone by having you pick a programming language that you want to learn, like Rust or JavaScript or Python, and then pick a tool that developers use like Git or Redis or Docker, and it has you build the tool with the programming language. And in so doing, you get better at both. You get better at the tool because you literally build it, and you get better at the programming language because you build the tool with it. It's a 2-for-1. They have a generous free tier, but if you want to pay for it, you can get a massive discount by using the link in the show notes. That's tej.as/codecrafters. And again, the link is in the show notes. I want tech to be accessible to everybody. I want you to thrive. I want you to be included, and I want you to have a great career. And to that end, I want to invite people to partner with the podcast and sponsor it if you have a similar mission. If you do, reach out. I'm on X at TejasKumar_. There's also links to that in the show notes. For now, thanks for sticking around. Here's my discussion with Corbin Crutchley. Corbin Crutchley, welcome to Contagious Code.
Hey, thank you, man.
I'm so happy to have you on the podcast because we spent some time in Utah at React Rally, and we talked a lot about a bunch of things. Most front of mind is the front-end framework field guide that you created, that you're giving away for free. But before we get into all of that, maybe we can talk to people about front-end framework and what those are and why they're important.
Yeah. So frameworks in general tend to be the way that you build a website, right? Or at least a modern website. The way that I like to describe it is that all frameworks provide one core primitive that everything is built around, and that's reactivity, right? So how do you take a bit of state in JavaScript, like a counter number, and synchronize it with the DOM, which is what the user actually sees? Now, that seems really trivial, but if you start diving into the weeds, you realize very quickly that there's a lot of complexity there. You have to bind events. You have to keep track of what the user is doing at all times to make sure that it's synchronizing with the state back and forth. So it's interesting seeing how that's been evolving over the past couple of years.
So that's the main problem is just making sure that code that you've written is consistent with what the user sees.
Yeah, exactly. And on top of that, like once you have a core primitive for that reactivity, you can start building off of it and doing really awesome things, right? So you can do things like make sure that your state, which is on the server, is able to get to the user in a more efficient manner, right? So there's this concept of side effects in computation, which is the idea of like calling state outside of the little box that you're within for your function. So how do you get that side effect management to behave kind of in a consistent manner rather than in a more erratic kind of way? And then, of course, there's componentization, which is like taking a huge chunk of code and breaking it down into more modular pieces of the UI. But it's just cool seeing how like you can build all of these on top of like a base idea of reactivity.
Is it fair to say that the reason all of this exists, front end frameworks, reactivity, all of this exists is because of just pain? It sounds like it comes from pain, right? Pain of developers going, I clicked the button, but nothing happened. Why is the state? Why is the count not what it should be? And over time, a bunch of us felt this pain. I certainly felt this pain. I got into this when I was very young, and at some point, companies, Facebook, etc., decided, you know what, we need to open source this and just give it to everybody, so it's more deterministic.
Right. And I think that that's always the trick behind most developer tooling, right? Is like that drive to make cool stuff, to let us as developers make cool stuff for end users, right? It's all about that incremental improvements on shipping and the speed in which we're able to get things out to our users.
Yeah, and there's something to be said for shipping. When it comes to developer experience, because I know I've been part of many discussions in companies over the years where it's we talk about, okay, cool, you want to add this new dev tool, you want to adopt this new framework, it's going to be a big rewrite, or it's going to take a lot of time. How do we, and the business discussion is always, how do we justify those costs?
Yeah.
And then I've got to go make the case of like, look, if we adopt the better developer tool, we can iterate faster. We can, if some competitor starts to mess with us, we can iterate. We can really like get ahead of problems more comfortably. Versus if everything's analog, right? We're not going to have that advantage. Have you had this discussion of dev tools and business value and rewrites and frameworks and migrations and things as well?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's interesting. I'm even working with a group right now that's looking to migrate from an older framework to a newer framework. And some of the argument is like, well, why?
Which ones?
So the group I'm working with is migrating from Ember in particular. And like, not that Ember is particularly old. They have a much more modern version that's actually fairly sleek. But they're looking to migrate from Ember 3 point something to React. And Ember 3 is like quite antiquated at this point, in comparison to their newer stuff.
Interesting. That's so okay. So you're having this conversation of let's maybe go to React because we can iterate faster. Let's do some spoilers about this field guide, because I think there's a ton of value in this for people, no matter their experience level, really. So we've established frameworks are these primitives for building applications that behave as a developer would expect. What are some differences between these frameworks? For example, there's a lot of discourse. People say React is great, Angular sucks, or vice versa. If they all solve the same problem of, look, just make my code consistent with the UI, why are there so many? What differences are there?
Yeah, so some of it is in the approach that has been taken to this point, right? Now, Angular has shifted away from this model, but they used to use something called Zone.js, which allowed you to just like imperatively mutate classes in order to update state in the UI. Excuse me. Meanwhile, React has a much more explicit state model where you have to call a function in order to cause a re-render of a function. And then Vue has much more of like a signal style proxy based state API. And it's interesting because between the three, there's a lot that's going on where like you're able to have like imperative management in Angular, which feels very natural but has a lot of gotchas. You have React, which has like this explicit state model, which is like great for knowing when state re-renders, but then re-renders can occur more often than you expect because of some of the overhead around hooks and stuff. And then Vue has like magic properties, which feel very like interesting and diverse, right? Like challenging to approach in their own ways. So it's one, like what mental model like vibes best with your team and with your knowledge level. But then there's also like ecosystem size, right? Like React has a much larger ecosystem than the alternative. So being able to leverage existing tooling is pretty cool. Or like Angular has a lot of first-party solutions that the other frameworks tend not to have. So like they have an official UI library, which is pretty uncommon for one of these frameworks. So it's just interesting. It's all trade-offs, right? Like everything in engineering.
Interesting. So they all solve the same problem, but slightly different ways. And I love that you like enumerated those ways. For example, Angular is very imperative, and until recently relies on mutating like an instance of a class, which, as you mentioned, has a few gotchas because you don't know. It's sort of like the same cascade problem with CSS, right? You don't know where something's changing, as far as I
Right.
know. With React, everything's immutable, but that immutability comes with costs of copying and cloning between renders. And then you mentioned Vue.js has magic properties for reactivity. So you said something interesting. They all do solve the same problem in roughly the same way. And do I understand correctly that you can get pretty much the same results, barring like a few milliseconds between them? Like you said, it's what, and this is to use your words. You said it's you use what vibes the best with your team. So really, it's more a question of taste for really the same benefits across frameworks. Or am I understanding this wrong?
It's I think that there are some differences in key areas, right? Like React and Vue use virtual DOM, although Vue is starting to move towards vapor mode, which uses more of like I don't know exactly the terminology there, but it uses more of a solid JS style method of recreating the DOM. Meanwhile, Angular has an incremental DOM, which works fairly differently. So if you're looking to build a render outside of the DOM, so say that you want to build a native render or like React Native, or you want to build a CLI render like React Inc., those might be more challenging with Angular. But unless if you're going like really, really custom and you have some very specific needs, I actually think that I stand by what I say in the sense of like, if your team's more comfortable and familiar with one tool or another, I think that should be the deciding factor more than anything else.
That is so good to hear. It's funny. We had an episode on the podcast recently with Alex Lister from the Vue.js and Nuxt community, and I asked him, I was like, why do people choose Nuxt in Vue? And the reason I asked is because I've never chosen Nuxt in Vue. And it's not because I think they're inferior tools. It's just that, like you said, right, the mental model, React vibes with me better.
Sure, yeah.
Specifically for UI interaction as a library, not as a framework. As a framework, meaning like a frame within which you work, like routing and all of this is included. In terms of frameworks, I actually use Astro like as my go-to for everything. But I've never chosen Vue. So I asked Alex, I was like, why do people choose Vue? Who are the kinds of people that Vue, again, to use your language, vibes with? And his answer was so interesting. And one that I didn't expect, right? He was like, look, people who choose Vue are usually people who come from like the PHP sort of Laravel ecosystem, where they expect JavaScript to be JavaScript. They don't expect like a bundler, a build system, a transpiler, the things you would need for like React and JSX. And I thought that was so interesting. To your point, different people have like vibe with different things differently. And does your field guide cover that? Like these developers with this type of background choose Vue. These developers with this type of background choose Angular for whatever reasons, and so on.
I haven't touched on a lot of the subjectivity in my book. I like the idea of kind of like here's a challenge, right? The minute you as an educator step in and make a subjective call, not that it's a wrong thing to do, but the minute that you do as an educator is the minute that you start swaying opinions, right? And that's not a bad thing. If you're looking to help improve the landscape and you want to make a more like objective call on what you think is the right way to go for it, right? I think the challenge that I had with writing the book is that like, because it teaches the three frameworks at once, the three major ones, there's a bit of like, what if someone that typically likes, say, .NET or C#, which is where Angular tends to thrive because of classes and OOP, what if they ended up really liking Vue? And now I'm telling them, well, yeah, but that's not the right way to do it. It's like, well, maybe, right? Like, it depends on your team and what they like. But I wanted to give a lot more freedom and like kind of be a more hands-off approach in terms of the subjective aspects. Like I want to be able to let people decide.
Yeah, what I mean instead of the subject, I'm not suggesting something subjective, but what I am suggesting is sort of a matchmaking type of chapter or so, where it's like you might vibe with Vue, if this is what you know. You might choose React
Mm,
if this is your background. I'm assuming there's going to be people reading this who maybe are picking a framework for the first time. And
right. That's fair.
I recently also shipped an episode with, or recorded, recorded an episode with an iOS developer who, Donnie Waltz, who moved away from the web specifically to iOS. And I was like, wow, that's a big change. Why do you do it? And he said, oh, there was just way too many things happening in the web. There's like too many libraries, too many
Sure.
options, too many build systems, TypeScript, JavaScript, observables. And so he said, look, I went to iOS and it's literally like just the primitives Apple gives me, you know? And so he has been out of touch for like years. He left around the time of like Bauer. And so if he was to come back today and choose something, he'd probably read your field guide and go like,
Hmm.
what should I? So I guess that's the long-winded way of clarifying my question. Like, let's say this a different way. If somebody is coming to pick a framework today, who has not touched a framework ever, is there a chapter? Or if not, how would you guide them towards the right one to choose without, being subjective?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there is not a chapter yet, but maybe that is good to guidance on adding a chapter like that, especially because I'm working on version 2. But the way that I would guide it is like try to build something fundamental with the first 3. Like go through the first chapter of the book with all 3. And if you find that one of them makes more sense or is more visually appealing or resonates with you better, go with that. If you have a team that is already working within a given framework, I would say that kind of makes sense to learn what they're leveraging, right? Or outside of that, I think that it depends a little bit on the ecosystem you're coming from, right? Like React has kind of dominated the Node Angular, or sorry, the Node space. Having JavaScript kind of through and through, React tends to be king there. I think you're right with Laravel and some of the other backend languages. You have Vue, which is like, very easy to pop into existing markup and just have like bits of the code that are able to run. And then Angular might be more useful if you're more familiar with OOP patterns or C# or even Objective-C, stuff like that. So, yeah.
I love that. That's an amazing takeaway. And I want to reiterate it for anyone listening, right? Because what you said was so valuable. If you're coming from something like PHP, where there's you generate markup as strings and you want to integrate something there, probably Vue or even HTMX would be the thing
Yeah.
for you. You said if you're more used to a functional programming paradigm where things are mutable and state is created new as opposed to changed in place, than React. Versus if you come from OOP, and that's so cool. That is such a great like general guideline, and I think that's one the listeners would for sure appreciate. Let's talk a little bit about state management, because everywhere I look, every framework is designed. You mentioned the reason, and again to throw back to the beginning. The reason these frameworks exist is because state becomes inconsistent between what the developer writes and what's on the screen. And so, okay, yes, we create frameworks. We create React and Angular and Vue and others. But then even though these frameworks exist, there's usually, and maybe this is not true, you can correct me here, but at least from what I've seen in my like React bubble, React has its own state management primitives, use state, use reducer. But there's external ones. There's Jotai, there's Redux, there's Xstate, there's all of this. I think they exist also in Angular and Vue, but again, I may be wrong. Why is there external state management libraries if the frameworks exist to solve state management problems?
For sure. Great question. In fact, not only do they exist in the other frameworks, I ported Redux to Vue and Angular.
Oh, wow.
So like the official versions of them. So like I feel maybe a little qualified to answer this, but maybe not.
Yes,
I don't know.
please.
We'll see. So it's interesting. I think that Redux existed to solve 2 big problems, right? The first one is that while state management solutions exist in each framework, patterns like in order to establish good debuggability, in order to establish good code height cleanliness, you tend to want to have patterns and conventions scaffolded around those primitives, right? So the flux pattern comes to mind for Redux, or signals style patterns for Jotai or alternatives, right? So it's interesting. you can sit there and you can have, one store and you can have 100 use states and you can provide a context that sets all of them. But what you're going to end up is you're going to end up with another instance of having a challenge figuring out where events are coming from, how to replay events, right? Like if you're wanting to go back in time and figure out what happened at point A instead of Z, then that ability to go back in time is really powerful. But then also in React in particular, there's been some performance challenges with using just context. So like you could theoretically make your own version of Redux with use reducer and context. But because there's no way to localize exactly which bit of state you want to re-render to which component, it tends to cause performance challenges where it re-renders the entire application when you change one bit of state, even if it's only used in a very low part of the component tree. And I think that the second point is like going to be fixed, right? The React team knows about it and they're working towards a solution with selectors, mainly around use memo and context and the use hook. And they have some ideas that they're floating that are not yet in production. But the other frameworks still have the first problem, right? Of convention and making sure that your team is on the same page with how you scaffold out, say, a global state management solution.
Interesting. Okay, so from what I understand is these libraries exist because the frameworks do solve the problem, but they solve it in one prescriptive way, and they solve it without convention. And so like tools like Redux and so on, they bring they bring, like, for example, with Redux, they bring the flux pattern, but also event sourcing in general. You start thinking in events, like I'm going to dispatch this event and then it's going to update my state and so on, versus like Angular's built-in state management primitives will not give you that sort of pattern. Is that appropriate? Is that accurate?
It to some degree, yes. I think the other aspect is that it provides guardrails, right? So like you can recreate some of what you're doing in Redux using services in Angular or the provide inject pattern in Vue. But if you really want to like stop yourself from making common mistakes around code reuse, right? If you want to make sure that you're having patterns, like one of the examples that I have, like more of a hard concrete example, is that you might have like services, right? And those services might make asynchronous IO calls to either your file system or your IndexedDB database or a service request, network request, whatever, right? Now, what you can do is you can move those service functions into the framework and then call those components or those utilities, right? But the challenge is that then you end up wanting to call those same exact services from outside the framework, and it gets very challenging to do so.
Right?
So something like Redux kind of like slaps your hand and goes, "Hey, stop doing that. You're trying to do things that you really shouldn't be doing. Don't put service code in your in your framework layer. Move them out of your framework layer. Make them more agnostic and more easily to readily available to access, and then call that back into your framework, right?" So that type of code organization is something that the frameworks can allow you to do, but they might not have the appropriate guardrails to stop you from making mistakes because they are intended to be more generically used than that. So
I love that. Okay, so the answer to this question is like part B, as it were, is they help you avoid coupling parts of state that shouldn't be owned by exclusively your UI, to your UI. Meaning, if you have some state that you maybe want to share with the server or something, then you use a tool like Redux. Okay, that is so great. That is so useful. I love this because a lot of folks to this day I think server components in React are a great educator with where state lives and where it should live, right? Because also we're seeing, for example, the boundary between server components and client components actually be a point of discussion, where previously with page-based server-side rendering, this was never a discussion because everything gets serialized into JSON and put in the page anyway. And so now we're thinking, hey, wait a second, should this entire card with a button be a client component, or should I just make my client component, meaning the thing with UI state, be just a button? Anyway, that's maybe an aside, but I love that. So we're thinking about coupling, and the reason these libraries exist is to help you separate your concerns in a healthy way. Like you said, slap you on the wrist and go like, no, this is not UI state. Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Did you have something to add?
Well, I was actually going to piggyback on what you were talking about. Like, I love that React Server Component. Like, I've run into so many instances where like newcomers to Next.js and React Server Components are like, why do I have to put use client on every single thing? And the minute I
Yeah.
hear that sentence, I'm always like, wait, hang on, back up. We've made a mistake. Like we've gone too far into client land, and we should maybe zoom out and approach that data layer logic, right? One of the things that I usually use it as an example is going back to like the smart dumb component arguments, right? Of like what components should be smart, which components should be quote unquote dumb, right? So should your button be the component that's making the call to your database? Probably not. You probably want to raise that state to the page level, make the database call, and then return it back and forth, and have more of a unidirectional data flow, right? But maybe if you're doing analytics, maybe the button making a call to your analytics might make sense, right? Who knows? It's always going to be contextual, and it always depends. But having that use client as kind of like a warning flag of, hey, this state might not need to be here, is actually, I think, a good thing, not a bad thing, even though it is causing like some minor headaches early on within the learning life cycle.
Yeah, and I think something that people don't realize, especially in React with this whole use client directive, is before server components, every use client was everywhere. That
Right.
was
It was
the only
everything.
way. It was everything. And so it's not like you're adding client you're opting out of client components when you remove use client, but use client is the default. Unfortunately, I feel like that just hasn't been communicated because they wanted
Yeah.
the default to be server components, but it doesn't work. That you can't just like whittle something like that into existence. Without getting too sidetracked, I want to get your best protocol approach for doing like cross framework migrations, because like you alluded to this, you're going from Ember to React, you said,
Mhm.
and that, I feel like you're not the only one. Look, I speak at so many conferences to so many people, and people have to do this oftentimes. Usually their library or framework gets sunset, or they realize, we're having a really hard time hiring for Vue, and so we're
Yeah.
going to have to hire this. So like these migrations happen, and I love that you alluded to this, because I want to extract from your brilliant mind ways that people who are currently in the middle of these can do it right without having to go back to the drawing board and git revert and make mistakes along the
Right.
way. So what are some tips there for moving from, say, framework A to framework B in a safe way?
Yeah. So my convention and my like thought pattern here tends to be pretty consistent. Is let's verify that the application works the way that we expect it to, and that it will continue to work the way that we expect it to. So setting up integration tests or end-to-end tests, like tests that live higher on the stack than, say, a unit test or a shallowly rendering integration test, something that actually tests your whole application, right? Then you move as much of your component logic out of the framework, right? So something like Redux, something like TanStack query, something that allows you to move your code out of the framework into a more generalized layer that you can leverage across frameworks, right? Then I really love the idea of having some glue code to some degree, right? So like, I don't think that it tends not to be a very good idea, in my opinion, from a business standpoint, to rewrite everything all at once, right? Because then you end up with like, oh no, we have application version 29.a, and like it just gets very challenging to manage from one to another, right? Because then you have to A/B test, you have to move users from one to another. It takes a long time. So instead, what if you could render a React component into a Ember component, or you could use a global state management like Redux and share it between Ember and React components, right? This is all stuff that is possible. Like Redux is actually framework agnostic, like we mentioned. TanStack Query is framework agnostic. Jotai, I think, probably is framework agnostic, although I would have to double check on that.
This is
But you
probably a
could,
good case to also use one of those, because then you can
right?
do that. You can switch between them easier.
Yeah, exactly. So some version of this glue code where you can move incrementally. Okay, here's my sidebar. Sidebar is in Ember today. Let's move it to React tomorrow, right? And then again, sticking to that convention of smart dumb components allows you to have a ton of flexibility, right? If you don't have to worry about migrating application logic in your button, now you can move all of your buttons to a new framework invisibly just by having like a button renderer, right? That spins up an instance of create root, creates a component of button, and then it's fairly basic as a component, so it's not spending a ton of CPU cycles re-rendering because it has application logic in it, right? So I think following best conventions and even spending a little bit of time refactoring in the first framework before you migrate things over might be beneficial. And then once you're all done, you have your tests that will automatically say, yes, this works. Yes, this doesn't work. Here's what you need to fix before you ship live.
Incredible. Okay, so step one, if you don't already have integration or higher tests, make them. Step
Yeah.
two, extract as much of your state and logic out as you can to something like Redux or Jotai. And step three, then actually like port component by component. And I think I heard you say start from like the smaller, like the buttons. Start from the leaves and then go all the way up. Okay, awesome. And this has worked well for you. What's the timeline for something like this that you're working on?
So the project I'm working on right now is actually a pretty large application. It's like 500,000 lines of code. So we're just beginning the migration, and it's going to be a pretty big one. So I'm expecting this to be 6 to 8 months, like bare minimum, right? And that's with most hands on board. That's with, but here's the good part about that news, right? Because we're tackling things incrementally, that 6 to 8 months will also allow that team to ship other things as well. They can sit there and
wait. So there's no code freeze. This is happening like concurrently.
Yeah, because you're doing things incrementally, and because you're like let's put it this way. Each of those steps can happen in concurrency. They don't have to be done one and then the next. You can have a team that migrates the button component and refactors code out of buttons. You can have a team that works on styles. You can have a team that works on the global state management. You can do all of these individually and have new features built out in React and glue them back in. Like, you can have a ton of flexibility if you take this incremental approach rather than trying to go all in one.
Okay, that sounds like the dream, doesn't it? Because every product manager listening is going to be like, "Wow, wait, I don't have to do a code freeze."
Right.
Okay, so incremental, and then smaller components all the way going up. Incredible. I wanted to ask you. You cover React, Angular, and Vue, but I feel like the dark horse of frameworks. And UI work with JavaScript usually. Corbin is web components.
Oh, sure.
What are your thoughts on those? And I asked because I was recently asked about this by like a team of UI and UX professionals. So not framework and JavaScript developers. In fact, these people don't know JavaScript at all. And they were asking me for my thoughts on web components. Before I tell you what I told them, I'm curious, how do web components fit into this? Because they can, in theory, be rendered in any framework without the framework, right?
Right, exactly. Sorry. So it's interesting. Web components serves as the foundational model of a component-based system, right? Just like React, Angular, Vue, Svelte, any modern component-based framework is going to have a component system either of their own or, like Lit and Palmer before it, are going to leverage web components as that component system. What's interesting, though, is that it doesn't solve the problem that we described as the foundation of that component system, and that's reactivity, right? Now, there are some proposals in ECMAScript that are coming to fix that. There's the signals proposal, which I think is currently stage 0, maybe stage 1, maybe, I don't know. But there's also the observable proposal. So there are features coming in JavaScript to make this easier as time comes. And then there's the re-rendering, which is like the third component we haven't talked about right yet, which is how do you optimize code so that you don't re-render everything? Like let's say you have a list, right? And you add an item to the list view, or you rename the second item in a list. How do you make it so that the whole list doesn't re-render? Now that sounds really trivial until you think about how many like embedded components there might be, how many like this is a very deep rabbit hole that you can go down, which is why I say React and Vue have virtual DOMs. So it's not that web components aren't they're not a bad tool by any means, but they're not the complete picture on their own. So I think that they can be used as a good base foundation for a framework like Lit. But the challenge is that like if you already have that component base figured out, there's so many other things that you'd need to glue back in that it may or may not make sense depending on your stance as a framework.
I didn't know that. First of all, that was the most eloquent discourse on web components I have ever heard. Ever. So thank you. And in fact, like I haven't heard it put so clearly that web components don't have primitives for reactivity. Meaning you're just going to quote unquote use the platform. You're going to use like the built-in DOM events. Is that accurate? What I said? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah. You said it exactly right. Yeah.
Wild. And so there's no reactivity primitive. So there's no like set state and dispatch. But also there's no notion of re-rendering. So really it's just a component by virtue of just being a reusable piece of DOM.
Right. To some
Wow.
degree, there's still some lifecycle methods, right? Like there's the initial setup, and then there's a cleanup, and then there's a attribute changed method, right? So there are some lifecycle methods that are there, but there's no reactivity like we were talking about. So you'd have to,
That's
like, in order
wild.
to create a framework around it, like Lit has done, you'd have to create a rendering methodology. So, like, how do you update the UI from this primitive? What does a primitive look like? Like, there's still a lot that has to go into building a framework around these web components. Now, I will
Wow.
say, once you've solved those problems, like Lit, like other solutions that are out there, Stencil, some others, once you have a web component base, they might make for a really powerful shared component system, right? So let's say that you are a company that hasn't yet decided on a single tool to use, right? Like scale of Apple or Facebook or Microsoft, like they're not going to just decide to use one framework for every single project
Right.
because it depends, right? So having something like Google's material design web components, which I unfortunately are sunset now, but having something like that might be very advantageous because it allows you to have that shared component model reusable across multiple different frameworks that you can then glue primitives back into.
Incredible. Thank you for that. I this was the moment where I learned a lot more than I knew previously. So genuinely, that was so great. What? So let's come back to the framework field guide. Can you break? So you measure performance, right? You talk about performance in this. What metrics did you choose, and why did you choose those metrics?
Interesting. Now, by performance, do you mean like page speed, or do you mean like performance as in analytics and sorry, just making sure I'm understanding.
Yeah, I mean page speed. I mean like how long, how slow, how fast is
Mhm.
this versus that? Like under load, under complex UIs when people click like a million times, etc.
So, it's interesting. We're intending to have a dedicated chapter on this. The challenge is that the book that I'm talking about is actually a trilogy of books, where the first book talks about just the core APIs without like anything else. So how does reactivity work? How does component models work? How do you like extract code into reusable aspects? And then the second book is all the ecosystem stuff, which we're going to talk about performance and monitoring and profiling, all this other stuff. And then the third book is internals, where we talk about like literally write your own frameworks from scratch. So while we haven't published the second book, we have a draft of a lot of what's going into the second book. And I've done a lot of performance work in general, so I'll answer this more broadly. Anyways, I just wanted to clarify so people aren't like looking for a chapter that doesn't yet exist. But one of the ways that I love looking at performance is, one, depending on the framework you have, they might have tools. So React has the Flame Profiler, where you can sit there and you can say, how often is this re-rendering? Why is this re-rendering? And what is the timing it takes to re-render something? Angular has, I think they have the new signals debugger, which allows you to sit there and similarly say, when is this changing the signal? What is the signal changing? And what is it re-rendering? But if you don't have access to those tools, you can still use things like PageSpeed Insights to figure out what, like web.dev/measure. If you have a deployed website, so you can sit there and you can see what CSS is unused, what libraries are unused, so on and so forth. And then also built into most web browsers like Chrome and Firefox and stuff, you can open up a timeline profiler where you can actually see which functions are taking up the most amount of time, and sit there and go, okay, well, I have a for each is an array.for, array.from faster, and then doing a manual for loop. Like what are the performance optimizations I can do there?
All right. Awesome. I can't wait for that second book, and thank you for clarifying. I think not just me, and I think really honestly, the third book also is going to be absolutely bananas. As an aside, are you publishing these by yourself using a publisher? Have you been contacted by publishers? Because I like it's a book that is done very well, the first one anyway.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Are you what's the deal there? Are you going self-publish or?
Yeah, so I actually have had a couple of opportunities to publish with publishers, and every time I've thought about it, and debated it. And I'm not saying no for eternity, right? Like maybe one day someone will be like, hey, here's a carrot on the stick big enough that interests you for whatever reason, right? Whether that's being able to tackle opportunities more uniquely, like with a co-author that I might not be able to access otherwise, or, whatever the case may be. For now, though, I think my big motivation is being able to get people into tech, right? How do we get people into the jobs that we have and live better lifestyles because of it? Which I think opens up a great door to a conversation we can have at some point during this convo. But like life in tech is life changing, right? Like the money we make in this industry is like kind of incredible when you sit back and think about it. So how do we get people to that state where they're able to leverage that and improve their lifestyles? And that's why I'm self-publishing. We have our platform called Playful Programming, which we're trying to make a bigger thing here soon, which I almost spoiled an announcement, but I'm not going to do that yet. But we want to make sure that people are able to get into tech effectively. And by doing that, we're making it free with no caveats to that, no account sign up required anyways. Yeah, we just want to make sure that people are able to get in.
That's fantastic. And yes, we will have that convo. That's also why we do the podcast, right? That's the whole thing is it's a labor of love, but it's because we have been so richly blessed that we get to bless others.
Yeah.
And I definitely want to double click on that when we're done talking about this amazing framework field guide here. Excellent. So there's a book about APIs. There's a book about performance. Oh, not just performance, but about specifics, and then a book about implementation. What's the most complex framework concern that you've worked with? This could be either, look, I know you're a staff engineer at Descript, which is a complex app in itself. I've actually used it. I know I'm using Riverside. This may be awkward, but I have used it. It's a great app, but it is very complex because you got to double bind like a transcript with a video, make sure the state, like if there was ever a case for state management, it's that. I'm curious, speaking specifically from framework points of view, what's the most complex feature you've implemented, or a moment where you've been working with a framework, either React, Ember, whatever it may be, and going like, whoa, I would be so completely lost if there was no framework to support me here?
Yeah, I think the big one is code reuse, right? And in particular, talking about that reactivity model, right? When I was building out the bindings for Angular for Redux, right? The ability to have a signal and have a bit of code that I could change that would just re-render the component without having to think about it was like it was the moment that things finally like, oh, I understand. Like I get why signals are a thing versus what was there in the past with Stone.js, right? Because the big challenge that Angular had in the past, like using it as a specific here, or even React prior to hooks or Vue prior to the composition API, one of the big challenges was like, how do you take a lot of code that requires your component to re-render, and how do you move that outside of a component in order to reuse it in multiple different places, right? So whether that is, Tanstack query is another great example, right? I have a bit of code on the server. Now, how do I cause my component to re-render when an error occurs or when this occurs or that occurs, and that tends to be a very powerful primitive to be able to say, look, I want that reactivity to occur. And I want that reactivity to have side effects that may live outside of the framework and may not want to re-render at this part, but do re-render at this part. So I think understanding the nuances of each of the frameworks and being able to make sure that the code is re-rendering, but only re-rendering when you want it to, which is always like the big major caveat, because it's easy to just loop like forever and it checks something every 10 seconds or 10 milliseconds, but it's harder to do that and only re-render when you specifically need to. I think that tends to be the biggest challenge.
It's interesting because the component model for UI components, even web components, is something that solves a piece of that problem, right? Because it makes components isolated and reusable, but we fall back right into it when it comes to logic. But like for the reasons you said, we tend to couple then the logic for those components to those components. And the components are cool, but sometimes we want to cross-cut logic. And so what I'm hearing from you, the composition API, hooks, etc., are the superpower that help you do that. Excellent. Absolutely. Very, very cool. One thing that has been extremely valuable for me as I So I'm currently working on a project that just a side project that I think is really fun to build. It may become a product, it may not, but it's just a really awesome like working learning experience. And as I build this thing, I come across these places where I need like cross-cutting patterns. I have logic in component A and I need to use it in components B, C, and D. And I'm thinking, how do I do this? Like, how do I abstract this appropriately for code reuse, for logic reuse? I used to have a way of doing this before, Corbin, just like you probably. But now, I use AI a lot for this.
Oh, sure.
Like I use cursor, and I literally like I'll select all, I'll press Command K, and I'll write extract as much of this as possible into its own testable isolated function and hit enter, and it will do that, Corbin. It will go line by line and be like, okay, what, and it will extract functions, and then I put those functions in their modules, unit test them. And how do I do unit tests? Well, I'll just make a new file and I'll press Command K and be like, test this thoroughly. We'll generate the tests. And so what I end up with is decoupled logic that I can then export and import in my other components. Absolutely bananas. Have you been using AI like this? Have you been like skeptical? Have you been optimistic? What's your take on that?
It's funny. I was very, very skeptical, and I still am to some degree. But it wasn't until like very recently, like multi-file in VS Code recently, like at GitHub Universe this year, like 2 months ago, that I was like, okay, I'll give it a proper try, right? And one of the use cases that I really love doing actually is having an API in mind. Like when I first built out my first form library, House Form, I had an API that I knew I wanted to build, but I didn't know how I wanted to build it, but I knew how I wanted the behavior to build. And anyone listening is probably thinking, well, that's TDD, right? Like that's a perfect example for TDD. Here's the problem. Writing code without an implementation is rough, right? It's just not, it's like, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but every time I have to write a test that doesn't have a backing behind it, it's always like, well, is this going to pass? Like maybe it should,
Yeah,
but what about this edge
yeah,
case? What about this? What about, whatever, right? So what I did is I there's been a couple instances where I have a function definition, or maybe of even TypeScript definition, and I'll be like, can you write a few tests that like set me up for writing the code and having it all pass? And that's been really wonderful because it's pretty good at being able to identify, okay, here's the inputs, here's the outputs, these are the edge cases that I need to figure out.
fantastic. Yeah, I can only echo that. And I'm so glad to see you slowly converting,
Yeah.
because it's it's such a mixed bag. But I feel like it's only a matter of time until the whole world sort of adopts it. But we'll see. We'll see. I'm happy to be proven wrong. I can tell you that it's just accelerated my workflows tremendously.
Okay.
All right. So let's continuing on this amazing framework field guide part A book, and then part B and C. Let's talk a little bit about motivation. You alluded to this earlier, right? Why you want to make this book? In fact, you did make this book. You're making two more parts. You're giving away everything for free, because you want people to be able to get into tech and thrive. Wow, Corbin, that's so idealistic and altruistic. Why? And I'm asking because, like, look, I think we're all familiar with the Millionaire Boys Club, right? There's a ton of people making courses, content. I myself have written a book that sells for way too much money. I'm not even mincing words. This book's like $60 or something. I didn't set the price. I went with O'Reilly, and I'm not knocking them. I think they can do whatever they want. It's a business at the end of the day. But so there's a bunch of people doing stuff like this for money, and here you are writing your book, giving it away for free, just out of the goodness of your heart. Why?
Yeah. It's funny. For context for everyone else, this is actually a conversation that Tejas and I had in Utah. And it was such a cool conversation because it touched on a lot of different avenues, right? The big founding like model for me is that like I had a lot of challenges growing up. There was some like housing instability challenges like in high school. But the big one is that I have schizoaffective disorder, which is schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And in high school, I had a bit of a run-in with mental health, as one does when you tend to have these disorders. And I had a bit of to be bleak, a suicide attempt. And it wasn't until people were like, hey, you know, there's more to live for. Here's why, and like give it a shot. That I started applying myself, and I started working full time in the computer industry. And once I had once I was able to afford medication and leverage it and use it more efficiently, my life, like my ability to live my life, has just improved so drastically, right? Um, Being able to have that stability and that fortitude to be like, no, I can wake up every morning, I know what I want to do, and I can accomplish it, is just life changing, right? And my medication costs thousands of dollars without insurance, right? Just like in exorbitant amounts of money. And without the insurance from tech, without XYZ, I realistically probably wouldn't have made it very far. You know what I mean? So I'm kind of sitting here like thanking my lucky stars that I'm sitting here, and that I'm able to not just provide value for other people, but provide value for my family, for myself, for the ones I love. And I want to help other people be able to do the same thing, right? Like it's almost like a non-option for me to go down this path, because if I didn't have this opportunity, where would I be, right? So helping other people get that same opportunity is hugely important to me.
That's the most beautiful thing. Like, and you and I are I feel like cut from similar cloth, because same dudes, like same thing. Like I for me, it's more physical than mental, but I'm dependent on medication that costs, as of today. I'm going to take it after this episode, believe it or not. And the one injection I'm going to take, Corbin, give myself in a vein, costs $5,000, and I need this every Monday, meaning 5 times 52 weeks in a year. 5,000 times 52 weeks in a year is a lot. It's $250,000 roughly.
Right.
On just medicine, without which I will for sure die. Like 2 weeks, I'm bleeding to death. And so, I applaud you. I mean, I think that's, and you know what's really awesome, Corbin? You and I tend to give away a lot of stuff for free because of it. I think there's something there that makes you go like, you know what? None of this matters. I don't know if you agree with that. I'm curious to get your take, because for me, sure, like my book is, spoiler, actually give away my book for free a lot to people. Don't tell O'Reilly, but I believe that none of this actually matters. Like a lot of people say, "Hey, Tejas, why don't you, So someone actually told me, Corbin, when I mentioned that I was just like working for a company, minding my own business. This actually happened, unfortunately, surprisingly, not in San Francisco, but in Miami. One of these like amazing engineers, and like hustlers, like I'm gonna be the next, Steve Jobs, like this kind of person. Again, not knocking them, I think that's cool. Came to me and said, Tejas, I think you're wasting your life. And I was like, what do you mean? I think, look, you have all this potential. You could build the next unicorn and be the next this and be the next that, but instead you're just like doing consulting. And I was like, wow, thanks, man. Screw me, I guess.
Appreciate that. Yeah.
But part of the reason is I just actually, Corbin, believe that none of this really matters. That like it's cool, it's nice, it's fun, it's definitely fun. But does this resonate at all? Maybe I'm rambling. I'm curious to hear like what's your take on that?
Yeah, it's funny. I have a lot of people, because I do a ton of open source work. I depending on how you count it, you can be generous and count the number of NPM installs I help maintain to be like 20 million a week or something crazy like that. And
oh my word.
It's actually ridiculous. I think about that like more often than I think. And I get asked a couple times, like, why do you do that? Like you're doing all this open source stuff and it's all like free and whatever. And my reason behind that is the same reason why I give away books and whatnot. There's people behind the screens, right? Like there's users, actual human beings behind that count of 20 million. Now I'm sure it's not actually 20 million because, CI/CD, whatever, right? But even if it's 100,000 people, right? Even if it's as conservative as an estimate as that, I was able to help that many people be more efficient or do their job or get a paycheck, whatever the case may be. And we're starting a dialogue there, right? Whether or not I know that person, whether or not they know me, there's a dialogue there between the user of that software and the effects of that software, right? The positive outcome there. And I think that that's the important part. The rest of it, like do we use React, Angular, and Vue? It's like, well, what does the team want to do? right? What is the human aspect, and how are we going to work through this as people? What is the outcome of the coding that actually matters, right? Because I agree, I don't think that most of this matters if it's not going to like help benefit humanity or people, right? We should be spending more time with our families, maybe a little, and this is maybe me talking to myself a little bit, but maybe a little less time maintaining open source projects, maybe a little bit more time hanging out with family.
Yeah. I like that you mentioned that there's people behind the screen. There's people behind that 20 million.
Yeah.
And I think that is extremely profound because we don't believe that. I can share here. I'm about to share with you something that brings me a lot of shame because I was not, man. Side note, I recently published a blog post that was on Hacker News and got lots of attention. And in the comments, there was somebody, a coworker I worked with, Corbin, like 8 years ago, who literally
Mm-hmm.
came out of absolutely nowhere to tell everyone what a horrible person I am in the comments, just because everybody liked my blog post.
Oh
It was the
no.
weirdest thing. And he's like, Tejas, this is Rich coming from Tejas. I worked with him. He was a real piece of shit. Like, there's lots of anyway.
Oh.
And so the reason I bring this up is because you say, there's people behind the screen when it's like this 20 million downloads. I feel like on the internet, people don't operate this way, and this is maybe just me
Yeah.
being jaded, right? But oftentimes it's pretty disconnected from the human experience, especially like if you've known the sort of like Dr. House, like Sherlock type engineer who leaves like negative things on pull requests, and the do better, try harder type of person. I feel like a lot of that just comes from just not seeing the human behind the screen. I guess that's my long-winded way of, one, appreciating your statement there, but two, asking, has that been your experience? Like, you know what I mean? Like, have people engaged with you when they download your open source projects, go like, thank you, Corbin, you support my business, versus, cool, I just NPM installed
Yeah.
something, I'm gonna go build.
Neat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, it's interesting. I think that there's a couple of factors at play here. Like, one, I say 100,000 people like it's nothing, right? Like, think about, just like pause for a second cognitively, listener, and think about 10,000 people in a room, or 100,000 people in a room. That's so many human beings. Like
Yeah.
I don't remember what the study was, but I'd read a study once that was like, you literally can't fit a certain number in your head. And I don't know about you, I can't picture 10,000 people or 100,000 people. 10,000 maybe. It's like, okay, that's a pretty big stadium, whatever, right?
It's like a
I
Coldplay
don't
concert.
know what 100,000 looks like in terms of human beings, right? Maybe you do, I don't. So like, one, I think we on the internet have a really challenging time making numbers back into people,
I like
right?
that.
And to some degree, I agree. Like yeah, I've gotten a lot of, this doesn't work, you're stupid, and whatever, right? But every now and then, I went to a meetup, and I ran into someone who used a piece of software that I use, and he knew I would be there, so he actually brought like a bottle of alcohol, which sounded really sus at first. I was like, yo, hang on. And he then explained, he was like, no, I run my own distillery, and like the challenges that I've come across in my industry have been greatly benefited by some of your work. Like, I just want to give you this as an
Wow.
appreciation. And that was
Wow.
like such a human moment for me, right? Like, whoa, this is a tangible thing. I'm helping this dude's business to some degree or another, right? How wild is that? And I think that that's the important part, is like, I think, I don't remember who it was that I was talking to, but you have to take like the assumption of good, like the positive comments towards your thing, as if 100 people or even 1,000 people were saying it, versus the negative, which is one person saying it, right? Because the silent majority of people are more likely to appreciate your work but not talk about it to you, because they assume that they're
Wow.
getting in your way, they're whatever. So it's an interesting like mechanism for trying to denumerize individuals as people.
That is, I love that. You are spitting some real wisdom here, man. I must like this idea that, look, when there's people saying negative things, that's one. It's a drop in
Right.
an ocean of 100,000, maybe even more, who what you said, they're not saying good job, they're not saying nice things because they're just happy. And
Yeah.
also, it's my own experience, Corbin, that when I'm happy, I tend to not like sit and think about how happy I am. I'm just happy, you know.
Right.
Similar to a lot of us have negativity bias. This is why the social media
Oh
algorithms,
yeah.
the news is always something negative because we pay attention to it because it's good to pay. Like it benefits us in terms of like evolution to protect ourselves. Like if I'm driving home, I will remember the exact name of the street where I saw a car on fire versus just driving home and I saw a puppy on this. I won't remember the puppy street. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Right.
Like we're attuned to the negative, and unfortunately, I like what you say. Unless we're careful to just sort of reorient, go like no. For every one of this, there's 100,000 of that. Unless
Hmm.
we're careful, we can go down some spiral. So all that to say, I'm going to extract from this discussion. That as sort of like a practical takeaway is to remind myself, hey, this is just one thing. There's a lot more of happy where this one negative is. I think that's so valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Excellent. Let's talk a little bit about giving stuff away because again, you're motivated by including people, helping people get into tech. Do you follow up with these people? Have you, like you mentioned, the guy with the bottle of alcohol, right? That's awesome. That's so humanizing. Have you met people who have read your book and went like, "Hey, I got into tech because of you"? And I ask, as somebody, I also published a book, and I do get the occasional like, "Thank you for writing this." Like, oh my goodness, I get React now. What was that like?
It's I think that there's like a challenge there in following up. Not that it's impossible, just that it's a challenge, right? Because you run into so many people in general, whether it's positive, negative, or whatnot, right? That again, like you said, following up with the positive is like, oh well, they said something nice. That's
Yeah,
it. like that. There's that natural intuition to just stay in that, like, oh, that's it. Um, but the person who gave me the alcohol, I still follow up with them occasionally. I know how they're
that's
doing.
awesome.
They're seems like they're doing pretty well. And also one of the things that I like to do is I like to keep a pretty open door in general. So if anyone and if you're hearing this, if you think this is cool, let me know. Like
Go
my door
DM
is
him.
wide open. Yeah, go DM me. Yeah, I'm right here. Uh, and I try to make sure that like there's the flip side of what we've been talking about of the end users being people. But you, Tejas, Corbin, we're people too, right? Like we're this not just this ephemeral voice that's coming over the radio waves or whatever, however you're listening to this, right? We are like tangible people who have our own thoughts and emotions and opinions and whatever else, and we can be approached too. Now, everyone's like tolerance for how they approach and time schedule and whatnot is different. And I'm sure mine will continue to evolve over time. But for now, I want to make sure that as many people that want to be able to have a conversation are able to do that. So, come talk to me, basically.
Awesome.
And that's always been my
Awesome.
policy up till today, at least.
Fantastic. You mentioned so look, you're a staff engineer. I know a staff engineer is a big deal. I'll say that. I'll flex for you. I gas up my friends. And it's true because like it means you're very technically competent. At least is what it meant at Spotify when I was working there. Just different companies have different things, but
Right.
a staff engineer is one who is very technically competent, but also can affect impact not in their own organization in a company, but across organizations. So like you'll
Hmm.
build something with marketing, and then you'll go to engineering, and then you'll go to R&D. Like you'll security. You're just like in different parts of the company. That was Spotify's definition. I don't know if it's that way at Descript. I would guess it is. In any case, Corbin, you're extremely competent. You even proved it, like with your book and the discussion we had earlier about frameworks and so on. But on the other side of this, you've got your mental health issues and
Yeah.
the background of home instability and all of this. Where does that come from? Did you, like me, grow up coding? I've been coding since I was 8 years old. Is this something
Hmm.
you fell into like after getting treatment? Like how does you talk about helping people get into tech? Let's use you as an example.
Yeah.
What was it? Was there a framework field guide that you picked up and read? Like what? How did that start?
Yeah. So, I didn't really get into software engineering until after treatment, but I had gotten into computers in general well before. Like it's always been a fascination of mine. My grandfather, who for the most part of my younger years raised me, he used to have these stacks of computer magazines because he used to be like a computer science major in college and did some stuff for the military and stuff. And he used to have these stacks of PC Mag, right? And I would just go sit there and read it. Like I knew way too much about the RTX 9 or like 970 and the whatever else, right? You know, I was sitting there specking my computer every week, not knowing how much money was money, right? Like, you know, I knew I couldn't afford it. That wasn't going to be reality, but I could build it on paper, you know? And I remember it was always a problem that needed solving, right? Because ironically, once I stopped living with my grandparents, I didn't really have a computer at home, really. So I had to go do a lot of my assignments at the library. Well, the library doesn't let you save files long term. So either you have something like Google Drive, or the solution that I had is that they didn't lock down their bootloader. So you flash Ubuntu on a USB stick, and now you have your own operating system that you carry around everywhere, right?
That is so smart.
Or like I remember I begged my mom one year, just begged her, like, Mom, please, I need an Android tablet. I need a something to read, but whatever, right? And she got me this Nook HD. I think it was the Nook HD Plus even. And it ran like a modified version of Android specifically for the company Barnes & Noble, which is like a book retailer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And well, it doesn't run the software I want. It doesn't have Facebook. It doesn't have whatever else, right? At the time, I was big on Facebook when I was younger. So I found out a way that you could flash a custom mod on it, like a custom ROM, right? So now I'm running Cyanogen. Well, now that's great, but I can't type my papers up on it. So what I did is I bought, and this is a true story. I need to go find pictures of it at some point. But what I did is I bought a pizza box, tied some string to the top and the bottom of the pizza box so it would stay open. I took some tape and taped the top of the tablet to the top, bought like $1 USB dongle and a keyboard from the thrift store. And now I have like a full-blown like laptop tablet thing with a pizza box that I would close, take it with me to school. Like it was so janky. But it was mine. It was cool, you know? Like it was always about that problem solving, right? How do we get to the next thing given the constraints that we have today? And I think that type of problem solving really helped set me up for software engineering, because by the time that I was ready to enter the workforce, I was 16. I'd just gotten out of the hospital like that year, and I was given an opportunity to intern at a school for like IT stuff, just fixing their computers and doing this and doing that. And it's because it was a startup charter school, so they didn't have any funding. So they hired 16-year-old me to go do it for them for free for a year and a half. And eventually that led to a job, like a, you know, paying minimum wage job. And eventually my open source stuff took off enough to find me a different job in software engineering. And yeah, like the rest is just kind of like continued work from there.
What was that open source project?
So this is interesting. We think of open source as code, right? But I had been exposed to the Linux and, you know, because of the Ubuntu stuff and Cyanogen mod and whatever. And I knew that code was a thing, but I didn't want to be a programmer originally. I wanted to be a designer, a graphics designer. So I gathered a bunch of my friends from Google Plus, and yes, Google Plus was a big part of my life, believe it or not. And we started an open source project that looked to imitate Material Design right as it came out. So we had an icon pack called Material OS, Material Open Source. And it just had a bunch of like the most talented designers I've ever met working on a bunch of icons. And one of my friends went and built a website called Material Colorize. And she like made it really like look great and put our names at the bottom of it. Even though I didn't code the website because I was participating in Material OS, she put my name on the bottom. And it went viral on Reddit from what I was told, or viral. I don't know what the actual numbers were. And someone in Sacramento, the city that I'm in, happened to see the website, saw that I was from Sacramento, and reached out to me via DMs and offered me a web developer gig. That's how it all started. It's crazy. Like this is what I was saying crazy. Is that like no one has this story, and it seems like such a mythical fake story because it just worked out so well for me. Like I'm so fortunate that like I know a lot of people who've had to work a lot harder to get even close to as far as I've been fortunate enough to make it. So how do we help reduce that barrier of effort? You know?
And so you started working at this person's company, doing, was it web stuff? Was it design stuff? What was it?
it was web stuff, because at this point I realized, like, oh, I'm actually terrible at design. I really need to focus more on the software side of things. Like, I think this is where my skills are better used. So they hired me to be an Angular 2 developer. And this is actually how far back the book idea goes. Even though I had only been writing it for the past 2 years or so. Even back 6 years ago, when I started learning React for a different gig, I went, wait a minute, there's a lot of similarities between Angular 2 and React. We should have some kind of resource that helps you convert from one to the other in like a pretty streamlined manner. And that was where the idea for the framework field guide came from originally.
Wow. I love that we've come full circle, man. Like, we started this discussion about the framework field guide and we went into it pretty deeply, but now we also went through its origin story. I think that's absolutely wild. Corbin, like health issues and medicine stuff, we've already established that you and I have this in common. I don't know if you knew this. I was also a designer earlier.
Oh, I didn't know that part, actually.
Yeah, and also just love design, and also decided I'm not creative enough, and I do know how to write code, so switched to code for that reason. But now, you know what I've realized, Corbin, lately is I am really good at design still, and really love it. Like, I've been working in tech professionally for now 15 years or so, building on the web for longer than that, unprofessionally in internships and so on. And in every job I've ever had, I can say this: design has always been something that has been elusive. It's been difficult for every team except the teams that had like in-house help. And by this, I mean specifically Vercel and only Vercel. And Spotify-ish, but Spotify was too big. But that's the only places that actually had design dialed in, which, given my career, is bananas. Like, it's two companies. And so I feel like I feel a resurgence in getting back into design, because I think it's so elusive, and I think it's one of those things where you maybe have an innate sort of gifting for it if you've done it before. So anyway, not that it's relevant. I just think it's interesting to come back. Now, you know a lot of things. You've written these books, and you have this platform where people can go and play with code. Have you thought about? You seem very entrepreneurial. I'm just like, I'll put it blankly. Like, you build a lot of stuff and then give it away. Have you thought about building a company, a product? Has that been at the forefront of your mind? Because it sounds like you're already building stuff. Where are you at on that?
Yeah. So, I guess I can spoil some of the secret. We are working on turning Playful programming into more of an organization.
Awesome.
The specific kinds of organization I will save for later. I will say this much: it very much keeps in line with our spirit of giving things for free and being community driven and such. I don't think anyone that is a fan of Playful programming will be disappointed. In fact, they might be, that's obvious when they hear about it. But one of the things that we're looking to do is we're actually looking to ramp that up. We want to do a boot camp of some capacity in 2025. And again, a free, like community ran boot camp that actually has a certificate at the end that proves, hey, I did this and I'm worth hiring, and here's why, and so on and so forth. We want to do user account creation in the next year. We want to build a CMS. So we're talking about really ramping this up into a much bigger thing than it is today. But I will say that this actually comes at the hands of a failure of mine. I started my own company called OceanBit, which is now a consulting agency. But back at the beginning of the pandemic, it was a product. It was a developer tooling company. We had a product called GitShark, and it was, what if you could clone repositories on your phone or your tablet and like have a whole editing experience, everything. And we built the product.
Sorry to interrupt, but you mean, what if you could? What if, just hypothetical? What if you had a pizza box?
Yes.
and wow. Okay. Cool.
Well, and it's funny because that's the origin of the story, right?
Yeah.
Is obviously we have users in the world, whether it's first world or third world or whatever, right? There are people that come from places that may not have the financial means to have a desktop, but maybe they were given a tablet, maybe they have an iPad, maybe they have even a phone, right? Let's give those people the power to program and to be able to contribute to open source, to be able to log into their GitHub, to whatever, right? And that was the original idea. And we built an initial version of it over 2 to 3 years. And we had like a design system. Like I hired a designer, like paid him, and like we went wild, right? Shout out Ed Pratty. Ed Pratty is the best designer I know, and he's looking to be a dev, and he's crushing it at that too. Anyways, and we published a beta, got about 4 sales, and then Android went and broke all of the APIs we were relying on with the updated version. And we would have had to rewrite thousands of lines of code to fix the problem. And I was sitting there and went, I spent $8,000 to make $30. Maybe we should call it here. And that was the end of OceanBit as a product company.
Wow. Wow. So you tried to build OceanBit, which the Git Shark idea sounds really awesome, to be fair. And I do want to say that I guess Replit is what people would use for that type of thing now, or like StackBlitz. Okay, and so that failed. But then, how did this then become Playful programming? It didn't become Playful programming, right? But you said
Playful programming has always been its own thing.
Yeah. But you said this comes out of that failure. How exactly?
Well, it's allowed me to learn a lot, right? Like every failure is an opportunity to learn to some degree. So that's where it's coming out of. Is like I started building Git Shark for mobile first without verifying that is what people needed, and without verifying that that's what people wanted. And we kind of just had this initial vision of like this really polished prototype of XYZ, and then we started building it, and there was no feedback. There's no external communication with other people. There was no, you know what I mean? Like it was destined to fail because we failed to do the pre-work, right? So what we're doing is we're taking a different approach. We have a group of people that we're asking questions of. We're verifying the idea with other individuals and even like putting the idea out more generally. And we're looking for feedback and initial responses, you know? We're trying to adapt and change. In fact, Playful programming was originally called something else. It was originally called Unicorn Utterances. And we got so much feedback that the name was confusing and bad that we rebranded, right? Like we're trying to take this idea of like verification in the marketplace, whether that is education, whether that's developer tooling, whatever that marketplace is, we're trying to take that idea of initial verification much more seriously.
Awesome. That's a huge takeaway. We published an episode with Max Stoiber, founder of Spectrum and Stellate, acquired twice. And this was something that he said it's so extremely important to just like talk to a bunch of people and speak to them in their language and really hear from them and take it in. Also, it sounds like Playful programming is not created to cater to developers as the main audience, right? It's maybe would-be people who would become developers, which is more mass market, because like my mother is not a developer, but she could become one, and therefore she's part of this market, as opposed to something like Git Shark would I don't know that my or what is it, OceanBit? I don't know that like my mother or a non or yet to be developer would use it. I have a hot take about this. I think I would never start a company that makes developer tools. I just don't see this being something that the entire world can benefit from unless like a small audience understands its value and then starts to use it to then benefit the whole world. And I think this is a hot take for a couple of reasons, but I think clarification will reveal that it's not really a hot take. And let me explain. Vercel. Some would say Vercel is a developer tool. I disagree. Right? I don't think it's a developer tool because like it makes the entire world able to deploy websites to the internet. Right. That's not a developer. That's just like put stuff online. In fact, the main product was called Now, a long time ago, where you type in this command in your terminal, NOW, enter, and your site's live. One command. Amazing. Right. And so this is not a developer tool. This is just a way to put something online. Cal.com, right? A lot of people go, oh, it's open source and it's great for developers. Doctors use it to schedule appointments, you know? And you look at all of these things that developers have proximity to, and really, you don't even have to squint very hard. The successful companies are the ones that are not built for developers. In fact, the ones that are built for developers often have a much harder time making it because like their audience is so much smaller. It's a fraction of the world. Right. And I think the ones that are succeeding, deserve a massive like hat tip or pat on the back, because it's a hard game, developer tools. Like Supabase is crushing it. but it's hard because there's like a million different Postgres. Terzo is a competitor. There's Neon. There's
Right.
PlanetScale. And for what? For like a small portion of the human population. All that to
Hmm.
say, coming back to your OceanBit versus Playful programming, your addressable market is so much bigger with Playful programming, which I think is so cool.
Right.
Not that it's a for-profit business, but does that track at all? Like, is this also a learning that you would take with you to future endeavors? Like, don't build exclusively for developers, but for broader markets.
Well, and I think we can even take that one step further. Don't build for a specific market that is not looking to grow, right? Like build for
Mm,
people. Don't necessarily build for like specific people, right? If you can build for audiences that are more generalized and have more of a use case across the board, you're going to see more success in general. And also, like, I think the takeaway that I took in particular is that it's really easy to see a problem and retrofit a solution rather than asking clarifying questions and finding why the solution that they're looking for is the solution, right? So for example, one of the things that we're doing with Playful Programming is we are looking to build a CMS. Why? Like, what do you mean you're looking to
that's
build a CMS?
that's actually an amazing question. I would love, because like there's Sanity, there's React
Mm-hmm.
Bricks, there's
Mm-hmm.
WordPress, there's Joomla, there's whatever. So yeah, good question.
Right.
Where's that coming from?
So if you look at our repository today, all of our content, including my book, including everything, is in plain Markdown. And that might seem like a big surprise if you've seen our website, because we have tabs, we have interactive code samples, we have interactive all sorts of stuff. All of that is powered by an MDX style HTML comment system. So what this means is that you can take the Markdown, cut it, and paste it into any other platform and have 100% portability, just without all the extra fancy features that we've built out specifically for our platform, right? So we have data like lack of vendor lock-in, right? Which is one thing that we're looking to keep. But two, we want to stay an open platform. Whether or not we make money, whether or not we do whatever, we always want to make it so that we can't, like not built into our system whatsoever. We can't have content that is pay gated permanently. Now we might have content that is like, you might want to donate to us in order to unlock specific things or whatever, but we always want to have that backup of going to our Git repository and seeing a revision of that content on paywall, right? So what we're doing is we're building it into our systems. We want our CMS to be Git backed so that it makes a commit and a pull request and everything that we can review in order to stay as open as humanly possible. There's been some options that we've looked at that we liked in some ways and didn't like in others. But we think that our homegrown solution is going to provide a pretty unique experience for people that are looking to keep their content pretty available, and like peer reviewed and open to whatever organization they want to keep it open to, but also have a nice enough editing experience that it's invisible to the layperson that's not technical.
Amazing. And this is a need that you've discovered in your, because of the constraints of your organization, that
Right,
something like WordPress or Ghost is not going to cut it. So it's because they
right.
don't do like Markdown and Git style. Have you looked at Keystone JS?
Yeah, we've looked at Keystone. We've looked at a couple others. Admittedly, I'm not the lead developer on the CMS project in particular.
Okay. Yeah.
That would be Mr. James Venn, Mr. Fenfith. Shout out him. But we've had pretty extensive conversations about what works, what doesn't work, and how much effort it
Awesome.
would take to kind of like fit our organization's needs into other solutions. And we think that
That
our
is
own
so
CMS
cool.
might still be the way to go.
So in the discussion of build versus buy,
Hmm.
what I'm extracting from what you said here about building your own CMS in a saturated market of CMSs is is you really can't find something to buy that fits
Hmm.
your organization. This is usually when you should build, right? And I
Yeah.
ask this because I feel like there's a bunch of listeners here who are engineers in engineering organizations who get asked this by their managers or even by their CTOs. I was in a job once where we were using Calendly, excuse me, and it was the only problem with Calendly was it was very expensive. That's it.
Right.
That's the
Right.
only. But it met every need. Everybody was happy. Everything was satisfied. We were deeply integrated. And my CTO came to me and said, "Hey, Cal.com's too expensive. Can we do anything about it?" And I was faced with, okay, well, let's maybe think about an alternate solution. There's cal.com. Should we buy or should we maybe build something that's more tailored to our organization? Now, honestly, like if Calendly was already working for our organization, then cal.com, whatever, could have worked.
Right.
But there was, some discussion around should we build our own thing, because then it's like fully custom. So with that context, I have to ask, does that track? Like, I mean, you decided to build because nothing fits. Would that advice be reproducible to those listening, I guess, is for people who are facing the question, should we build, should we buy, and they know the constraints of their organization, how would you tell them to approach it?
Yeah, I think that you have a great solution there. Is like for example, we have guarantees as our organization philosophically. And I think that this is really important. People don't think about the philosophy behind their software or their software engineering teams as often as we should. With Tanstack Form, one of the libraries I maintain, our philosophy is that we never want to ship code that makes it directly into the user's hands. We want to ship code that is easily abstractable into what turns into what ships to the user's hands, right? So we want to build really strong primitives, but we don't want those primitives to be so like we want to keep them generic enough that you can adapt them and mold them into what you need, rather than shipping something that is so concrete and set in stone that you can just ship it right to users, right? Now, that's a philosophy that we maintain, and it goes into how we review pull requests, what features we accept or don't accept, right? In Playful Programming's example, our CMS establishes a guarantee that we have as an organization. Now, we could take something like Sanity or Ghost or whatever, and we could mirror that content through a database to CMS backup. We could do something like that. But there's the potential, philosophically, for that content to get stuck in that database and never make it to the backup of Git. And, it's easy enough to go, well, we don't really care that much, blah, 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 like kind of forget about that initial philosophy. So for us, there was a philosophical reason why, like foundationally, that we went to build our own solution. We have something in the interim that works well enough, which is just using Git, no CMS, right? And that works fine for the most part. We have recommendation software for people that need a little extra help. We're willing to do, like XYZ migrations, whatever. But long term, we want software that aligns with us philosophically. And I think that's when it makes the most sense to build your own. Is if you can't find something that's off the shelf, like missing features is one thing. Bugs are another thing. Payment is another thing. But if you can't align philosophically with the usage of your software versus the actual like needs of your business, then there's a big problem, right? Then you should maybe investigate building your own solution rather than reporting bugs, rather than getting a support contract, rather than something like that.
Interesting. I may need to ask you some clarifying questions about this, because I want to make sure it really lands. We don't spend enough time thinking about the philosophy of the way we use software. What does that mean? I mean, like, so your organization, it's an interesting discussion for sure. Your organization as a philosophy is that things have to be open, like you said, right? And accessible, and people have to be able to get in. They have to get their foot in the door. Is that the philosophy of your organization? And then, by building, by building the CMS, the reason this is being built is because there isn't quite a CMS out there that align. Okay, I see what you mean. It's computing like slowly. Forgive me, but I'm starting to get it. Interesting. This is why I think some organizations just don't use things like React, for example, because they fundamentally oppose the philosophy, going like, oh, this is way too much extra computation. Every function's called recursively, even if they don't change, and so on. Wow, I think that's another. Corbin, you've been dropping. So, you have a. Yes, interrupt me.
No, well, and I was going to say, I think that it's interesting because notice that the philosophies that we named were non-technical. The idea is that the philosophies of your technology don't necessarily have to be technical themselves in order to be justifiable, right? Like ideally, your business philosophy should be a business need or a business philosophy, not a technical philosophy. So when people say like, oh, React has so many re-renders and the whatever, blah, 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 it's like, well, maybe, but there's solutions to those problems. There's a React compiler, there's training, there's whatever else, right? And this is why like I wouldn't recommend most people to build their own X, right? If there's solutions out there in the ecosystem, let's go leverage them as existing. But the minute that the business philosophy dictates a shift in thinking, then you might want to consider building your own, right? So I think it's that difference between technical philosophy of like, oh, this mutability pattern is not pure, and because it's not pure, it could cause side effects. And it's like, well, maybe, but does it fit the business need, right? So I think that there's a difference between technical philosophy and business philosophy as applied
That is
in
so.
engineering.
I love that. And you know what? This is begging, Corbin, begging for a blog post about the philosophies of different projects. It's for open source
Yeah.
projects. Ideally, like peer reviewed by the maintainers. This is, for example, this is the philosophy of Next.js. This is the philosophy of Nux. That would be so cool. And like this is why I do the podcast. You know, there's so many ideas that just come out of this. I will say this: I choose Astro for everything as my go-to, exactly for that reason. And until this discussion, and circling back all the way to choosing frameworks in the beginning, until this discussion, I had a hard time putting it into words quite like this, where I say, no, it just aligns with my philosophy, non-technical philosophy, but philosophy nonetheless of how software should be built. Because Astro will defer interactivity until you explicitly say this island needs to become interactive at this time. It will defer not just interactivity, but defer loading the JavaScript until you say load it now. Astro also has support for server level components if you need them, but it's really the philosophy of Astro is look, don't add anything until you need it, or unless you need it, right? And I think that philosophy aligns with me so much better than a philosophy of React that previously was just like, just your entire root node, div ID root, your application from this point down is just all JavaScript. Good luck. You know, wow, that is so extremely cool. Also because I have been bitten by those. Like I try to browse the internet, and if for whatever reason I tend to travel a lot, I'm on a network where the JavaScript bundle can't download in time, I get nothing. You know, that's a philosophy thing. So incredible. Awesome. Hey, I want to be sensitive to your time. I do want to wrap up, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you Playful programming. You said that's seeing and somewhat of an overhaul that'll be shipping sometime soon. Your book as well. Anything you want to shout out? Any advice you have for people listening who would like to get into tech, would like to learn about frameworks, etc.? This is your moment.
Yeah. So I think the biggest piece of advice is also my self promo, right? Like as goofy as that sounds, like whenever people ask me what is the best advice to get into software, I would say find a community that works for you. Now that doesn't have to be playful programming, but if anything that I said aligns well with what you're thinking and how you're approaching problems, we'd love to have you. We are open to questions and try to do our best to answer them. We host weekly book clubs. We love open source maintainers and have opportunities for people to come join us as a maintainer or as a content creator. We publish blog posts, whatever. But even if playful programming isn't your thing, find a community, big, small, whatever, where you can feel comfortable. You can ask questions that feel quote unquote dumb, because there's no such thing as a dumb question, right? And just explore, right? Like, don't be afraid to try new things and adapt and improvise and explore.
Oh, I love that. I love that so much. We'll put links, of course, to all of that in the show notes. Listen, Corbin, it's been such an absolute pleasure. This has been a long time coming, a really long time coming. We talked last in like June or something. But I'm so thankful for the opportunity to talk to you about frameworks, their trade-offs, how to choose them, how to get your staff level engineering perspectives on so many things, but also talk about the human side of it, right? There's a person behind the screen. There's a background that leads to the decisions we make, and so much in between. So it's been such an honor to talk to an institution as yourself. And on behalf of myself and all the listeners, thanks so much for coming on and sharing all of this with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining my discussion with Corbin Crutchley. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you feel incentivized and motivated to pick up the Framework Field Guide, just in case there's something you may missed that we also didn't cover. I think knowledge is never wasted, and discovery is never in vain. So if you want to pick that up, I highly recommend it. If you want to check out Playful Programming also, there's probably something in there for you or someone you know to help them get into tech, and radically change their lives. like I did and like Corbin did. If you're learning from and or enjoying this content, then a great way to support it is to just share it on social media. If you're watching on YouTube, then if you want to like and subscribe to the channel, that would help make it discoverable. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, then if you leave a review, any review, but up to 5 stars, that will also help. Really, if you think it's worth sharing, then share it. That's the best I can ask for, and we'll see where we go. For now, thank you so much for joining this discussion. Thank you for your interest in engineering, and thank you so much for being a part of the Contagious Code podcast.